Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 40 of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, first off, I'd like to thank all of those of you who are new subscribers. I know I've picked up a number of people recently, and thanks for subscribing and for being here and for listening to Camera Position. And I'd also like to thank those of you who have recently put a comment on the iTunes store. I appreciate that, and certainly helping people figure out where quality podcasts, and I obviously from the comments that you've left, very kind and nice comments that you're finding what I'm doing here with Camera Position useful to you. And also, if you have a friend or two that you think might be interested in Camera Position and what we're doing here, I would appreciate having those friends know about us. So drop them a note and let them know that we're here. And also, for those of you who have not yet checked out the Photocast Network, a really neat clearinghouse of all the best in the world of high quality photo related podcasts, some that are oriented toward the creative side of the medium, and some that are oriented toward the technical side of the medium, and some that are a little hodgepodge of both. So take a look at photocastnetwork.com and take a look at some of the great stuff that's up there on that group of podcasts. John Arnold's Photo Walkthrough is one of the ones that I listen to regularly. I always learn a little bit of something from him. So thanks again for those of you who have shown your support for Camera Position. It's great, and great to know that you're out there. Well, if for those of you who are U.S. residents, you know that we have just celebrated Thanksgiving, our annual holiday of giving thanks for our place in the world and our blessings, and also a noted holiday for eating, and a giant feast that happens on Thanksgiving. And of course, anything that goes along with a giant feast, there's always leftovers. And so this podcast is a bit of a leftover jumble. The idea here is that I've got a number of small topics to talk about for Camera Position, and rather than divvy them up into many little podcasts, I'm going to put them all sort of in one spot, and we'll see what we can do about kind of doing a leftover hash here of various and sundry bits. The first thing I'd like to talk about is focal length of lenses. And I'm responding here in part to some notes that I've gotten from some of the listeners to Camera Position and people asking about positioning their camera, and also about focal length of lenses and so forth and so on. And so I want to clear up some bits and pieces. One of those bits is a sort of popular misconception. At least I think it's a misconception, and some people might take me to task on this, but hear me out and we'll see where we can go with this. One of those things is this idea that wide-angle lenses stretch out space and telephoto lenses or long lenses compress space. And I disagree with that. And I disagree with it because I think what we do when we put a wide-angle lens on our camera, or even in some ways more problematically when we use a zoom lens on cameras, we tend to do things that force the view or the field of view to create stretched out space. Let me see if I can explain what I'm talking about here. Here is a wide angle view taken from the Rialto Bridge in Venice. A 7.2 millimeter lens was used on a Canon G3, so it's got a little tiny sensor. I would guess it's probably equivalent to maybe 24 millimeters or thereabouts on a 35 millimeter camera. And here's a picture where space is in fact stretched. But here's what I maintain. I maintain that the space is stretched out simply because of where the camera is and how the camera is perceiving certain things. The boat in the lower left corner, for example, is quite close to the camera, and therefore it is larger due to the laws of perspective. And just in the same way that we would see that boat as a larger object in our naked human vision, here it is larger in the picture. Similarly, the boats in the background, even though they might be as big or nearly as big, are smaller because of the laws of perspective, people, buildings, etc., etc. What I've done here in this next image is I have simply cropped out a sort of a center or top left center section of that image. And one would sort of presume that this is a telephoto image, and yet what I've really done is cropped out the center. And what I maintain is that what I've done is the exact same thing as zooming in, or the exact same thing as changing focal lengths to a longer focal length of lens. And what that compression of space really represents, or if in fact we sort of believe that telephoto lenses compress space, what it really represents is just a narrowing of the angle of view. So if I had put a telephoto lens or used my little Canon G3 zoom lens to zoom in on this spot, what we'd see is exactly the same thing that we're seeing in this cropped version of that picture. So if you followed along on this so far, this idea that changing focal lengths of lenses merely changes our angle of view, our field of view, and that really all we're doing is changing how much or how little of a scene we see based on how wide or narrow our field of view is, then we can start looking at this other idea, which is that camera position. And I almost hate to use that phrase, but then again, why did I name the podcast Camera Position? Because I think it is a primal important bit in terms of what it is that we do as photographers. Once we choose camera position, up, down, left, right, relationships of subjects and how they line up in our three-dimensional world as being translated into a two-dimensional photograph, then once we've chosen camera position, next we choose field of view. And we choose field of view by choosing a focal length of lens, either by placing a lens on our camera if you're shooting with large format, as I often do, or medium format, or if you have prime lenses that are single focal lengths for your 35 millimeter or digital cameras, or if you're zooming on a zoom lens, you choose the zoom angle of view that suits what you'd like to include and, just as importantly, what you would like to exclude from the frame of the photograph. So the whole idea here is that choosing where you stand first and then choosing the focal length that best puts those things into the frame that you would like to have in and excludes the things that you would like to leave out is the next important thing to do. Now, sometimes this happens all in a matter of seconds. You move your body, move your head into a particular spot, and zoom or change that focal length very quickly, and bing, bang, boom, take the picture. But oftentimes it pays to kind of slow that process down, and think through the process of choosing where you put the camera. Which brings me then to my next point, which is my recommendation for the single most important accessory that any photographer can possibly own, and that is a tripod. A tripod is an incredibly valuable resource for you. And the reason I think a tripod is so valuable is because it slows you down, because it forces you to think about the intersection of where the camera is and how it relates to where the subject is and how much or how little of the subject you might like to see. And that whole idea of where it is that you're standing becomes very, very important. Of course, there are also some ancillary benefits from having a tripod as well, and one of the biggest ones is that the camera is not going to move. You're not going to have camera shake that changes the quality of your photographs, and especially if you use a cable release, which is somewhat more complicated now with our electronic cameras and electronic cable releases, although many of the digital cameras now come with some sort of an electronic sort of sender that sends a message back to the camera. Some of the more consumer-oriented cameras do that, or even just using the self-timer if the moment of exposure isn't terribly important to you. setting the self timer and allowing the camera to fire itself when the moment arrives. So the idea of using a tripod, and don't go to the discount store and buy a $30 or $40 tripod. Invest in a good tripod in the same way that you've invested in a quality camera and quality lenses and presumably quality other materials that you're using, if you're using a computer or printer or other materials to be able to get your images out into the world. Invest in a quality tripod that will hold up your camera, keep it steady, and keep it in the right spot. My preference, I love Gitzo tripods. I think they're fabulous. I love their tripods. I love their tripod heads. Yes, they're expensive, but are you going to stick your camera, your expensive camera, on a $30, $40, or $50 tripod? Or are you going to spend a couple of $100 or $300 to get a tripod that will hold your camera steadily and will never let you down in more ways than one? So the idea of a tripod is an important accessory for photographers, especially as a creative accessory. And I can't stress it enough how important it is to have a tripod to kind of slow you down, force you to put your head into the right spot. And I think that even if you are the kind of photographer who tends to photograph the flow and flux of life, the sort of instantaneous, decisive, Cartier-Bresson-esque moments in the photographic realm, I think that spending a little bit of time shooting on a tripod can really help give you that sort of idea of how to compose images in the slower way and then speed it up. And I think just about anything that I've ever done where eventually I want to get really good and really fast at it, slowing down and learning how to do it slowly first, and then slowly but surely speeding up the process by eliminating some of those restraints that I put on myself. So even if you're the kind of photographer who tends to want to photograph quickly and you're the sort of person who said, I'm never ever going to buy a tripod, I'm never going to use a tripod, try one out. If you need to borrow one from a friend for a little while just to see how useful it is, do so, but eventually you'll learn that a tripod can be an incredibly useful creative accessory, something that can help slow you down, help you see the world in a different way, and even if ultimately what you do is make photographs more quickly, using no tripod at all, using a tripod to begin really helps you to see the world well. And this brings me to my next bit, which is talking about the basic compositional principle of positive and negative space, positive space and negative space in a photographic image. I touched upon this previously in camera position number 18, where I was talking about that little cardboard cutout that I use to help me frame up photographs. And I talked a little bit about positive and negative space in that episode. But based on some notes from listeners out there, I realized that I may not have covered this quite as clearly as I could have. So we're going to dive back in here to the basic compositional idea of positive space and negative space. When I talked about this idea previously, I used this photograph, a photograph by Edward Weston of his son Neil's torso, and it's one of my favorite photographs to use for discussing this particular topic because, first of all, I think it's just a beautiful photograph, but also because it so accurately describes the idea of negative space and positive space. In this particular photograph, the positive space, or what we would refer to compositionally as the positive space, is in fact Neil, his torso, his body. The negative space is the stuff around Neil's torso, the slight black shapes on either side. And Weston's drawing of the border, of the boundary of the frame, left and right, really defines very carefully these beautiful sort of liquidy, languidy shapes that are being created at either side of Neil's torso. So what he's done by bringing the borders and boundaries of his frame in to the left and the right are making us aware not only of the positive space of Neil's torso, but also aware of the beautiful shapes created by the absence of Neil's torso and the shape or the space around his body. In looking around for some other examples of negative and positive space, I found these photographs by Ralph Gibson, who is one of my favorite photographers. I love his sense of playfulness, his sense of dreamlike reality in his photographs. I think he's really quite an amazing photographer. If you haven't taken a look at him, I'll put a link to his website on cameraposition.com. And he's also just a terrific photographer in terms of his use of contrast and the way in which he uses these deep, sort of impossibly thick shadows that really define the way we see a photograph. This particular image that we're looking at right now is another one that uses positive and negative space really quite effectively, here with this face and the way in which we perceive the shape on the opposite side of where the face is as an interesting shape in and of itself. He takes this idea a bit further here in this next photograph, where he uses a shadow that not only defines the face, but also begins to kind of do a push me pull you in terms of space with positive and negative shapes. So what we get is not only the outline of the physical face of this person, but also this idea that it's perhaps another face appended to this same person's visage. So I really think that not only can positive and negative space be drawn by the boundaries of the frame, but they can also be used in certain ways to allow us to see both solids and voids as parts of the subject, and the way in which those subjects interact becomes very important. While I was looking through Ralph Gibson's work in searching for those negative and positive space examples, I ran across this sequence of pictures, of two pictures, that I really thought were pretty remarkable. And they are from a body of work that Gibson did. And Gibson has worked in series or sequence almost his entire career as a photographer. And this particular pair of images was used in his book Deja Vu, which came out in 1972, 1973, something like that. And this pair of images was placed on a two-page spread such that the image you're seeing here first was on the left, and then the image you're seeing second was on the right, such that our mind bridged the gap between the gun and the half of a head of a person. And this idea that while the pictures were taken thousands of miles apart perhaps, and perhaps even years apart or months apart or at least weeks apart, that what we're looking at is something where we connect up these two events based on our mind's connection between these two pictures that are not at all similar, but we psychologically do that connection. So that whole idea that we talked about a while back about sequencing and sequencing of images and how important that becomes in terms of the way in which a viewer sees the images that they're looking at. So here is Gibson really giving us this sort of smack upside the head clue as to what it is that he'd like us to see in these images. And I think that's pretty remarkable. Which then brings me to my last bit for this episode of Camera Position, and that is a grouping of photographs that I had to pull together recently to talk about current work that I'm doing. And the reason for this is that the College of DuPage in Glen Ellen, Illinois, where I teach and have taught for a long time, about 24 years now, has a biannual fine art faculty exhibition in the Gallberg Gallery in the big Art Center building where I work. And the annual or biannual show consists of a number of faculty, a fairly large number of us, maybe 10 folks, are gathered together. So there isn't a whole lot of wall space, and so therefore I need to be a little parsimonious with images that I've chosen. And what I wanted to do was pull together a sort of representative example of the work that I had done most recently, 2006 images. And so I pulled together these four pictures that I've put in one image here so that you can kind of see them. And I'll put all of this stuff up on the cameraposition.com webpage. I think what I'll do this episode is put on a little link to an external web page that has all of this stuff on there, so it'll be a little easier for you to see. But the idea here that what I'm doing is not only pulling together images that represent my current thoughts about photography, but also pulling together images that have relevance one to another. And so I tried to find some photographs that I thought had consistent or common shape ideas, shape and shadow concepts, and looking at that idea of this circular or circular faceted shape in slightly different ways. And then, of course, this one portrait, which for those of you who've been listening, you can kind of see which one I ended up choosing. I ended up choosing the man with the hat instead of the man without the hat. I think it was more indicative of who he really is as a person. I somehow imagine him having that hat hanging on a nail right next to the door, and that hat goes on his head every time he walks out the door. So these are the 4 images that I will have on exhibition in the Gallberg Gallery at the College of DuPage in the Arts Center building. The show will open on the 30th of November and close on the 30th of December, so it's up for about a month. And the opening reception for the exhibition is Thursday, November 30th from 4 to 6 p.m. And so if there's anybody out there who is within the sound of my voice, I'd love to have you come to that exhibition. And I have a number of very talented colleagues who will have their work on the walls and on pedestals as well. So it should be an interesting event. It always is. See what these artists who teach are up to. So that's it for the Thanksgiving hash, the turkey hash, leftovers, mashup of a variety of different kinds of ingredients here, camera position and focal length of lenses and tripods and negative space and positive space and sequencing and grouping of images, and the idea that all of these things lend themselves to the way in which we create photographic images, and that idea that creating the image is a combination of all sorts of different elements of the ideas of photography. Thank you again for listening. Thanks to those of you who have written me with comments. If I haven't gotten back to you right away, it's because I've just got a volume of mail that just won't quit, but I try to get back to everybody, even if it's just a sort of thanks for the note kind of a line. And also, those of you who have gone to the iTunes store and left a kind comment there about camera position, anybody who hasn't done that, and if you've got a spare couple of minutes, going to that iTunes store, it can be very helpful to camera position in terms of getting more listeners. And also, don't forget the Photocast Network, where you can find great photography-related podcasts. So thanks again for being here, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography.
PhotocastNetwork.com, your photography resource in the podosphere. PhotocastNetwork.com